Hey everyone, and welcome back. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, and also that bell icon so you don't miss out on future deep dives. So today we're diving into a topic that's especially relevant for any UPSC aspirants out there, students navigating global affairs, anyone just generally curious about India's global role. We're talking about foreign aid and its impact on India's development.
It's a fascinating topic, really.
Yeah, and we've got some really interesting excerpts here from a document titled Foreign Aid, Method, Rule, and Impact on India's Development Dynamics.
I think one of the most intriguing things is how India is both a receiver and a giver of foreign aid.
It is. It's interesting.
So we're going to explore that dynamic, look at the changing trends, and even touch on some of the controversies surrounding it.
Yeah, there are definitely a few of those.
We'll also unpack the role of NGOs, the FCRA regulations, and even touch upon the recent CBI raid on Amnesty International.
It's a lot to cover, but I think it'll be really illuminating. I think so, too. So let's start with the basics. What exactly do we mean when we talk about development aid?
Well, it's basically financial assistance given by governments and agencies to support developing countries. The goal is to really help them fuel economic growth, tackle poverty, improve things like healthcare and education.
Right, so it's about empowering these nations to become self-sufficient.
Exactly. Sustainable progress is the aim.
Okay, that makes sense. But here's where it gets a little paradoxical.
Yeah.
India has a fast-growing economy, a thriving tech sector, a space program,
Right.
and a burgeoning middle class. So why is it still a major recipient of aid?
Yeah, that's the development paradox, some experts call it. It's important to remember that development is complex. Even with all that progress, India still faces challenges like poverty and inequality.
Right, those issues don't just disappear overnight.
Exactly. And that's where this concept of overseas development assistance, or ODA, comes in.
ODA.
Basically, developed countries, especially those in the OECD, have committed to donating a certain percentage of their GDP as aid.
Their gross domestic product.
Yep, exactly.
What's the target percentage?
7%.
7%, wow.
But very few countries actually meet it.
Oh, really? That's surprising. So how much aid does India receive, and who are the main donors?
Well, in 2011, India was actually the 6th largest recipient of aid globally.
Wow, 6th largest.
The big donors were the World Bank, Japan, Germany,
Okay.
the Asian Development Bank, the UK, France, the Global Fund, the US, and the European Union.
That's quite a diverse group. But I've also heard that aid to India is decreasing. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it is. There's been a noticeable decline in recent years.
Why is that?
A couple of reasons, really. Firstly, India's economic progress is undeniable. As the economy grows, the need for aid decreases.
Right, it makes sense.
And secondly, geopolitics are always in play. Alliances shift, priorities change.
So it's a combination of India's own progress and the changing global landscape.
Exact.
Any specific examples of this decline?
The United States, for example, has reduced its aid by about 25%. They were focusing on things like clean energy, food security, healthcare.
Okay.
And the UK actually stopped all aid to India back in 2015.
Really? Completely stopped?
Yep. They cited India's economic growth as the reason.
Huh.
Interestingly, the Indian government welcomed that move.
They did?
Yeah, they saw it as a sign of their growing self-reliance.
Wow. So it's almost like India is saying, we appreciate the help, but we're ready to stand on our own 2 feet now.
Precisely.
It's a powerful statement about their evolving global position.
It really is. And here's where things get even more interesting. While India is receiving less aid, it's increasingly becoming a donor itself.
Wait, so India is both receiving and giving aid?
Exactly. It's a fascinating dynamic.
Wow, I didn't realize that. So tell me more about India's aid program. Who are they supporting and why?
Well, their aid is mainly focused on their neighbors.
Makes sense.
It's a strategic move that reflects their aspirations as a regional power. In 2015-2016, their aid budget was around $1.6 billion.
Okay.
And a whopping 84% of that went to South Asia.
Wow, 84%. So who are the biggest beneficiaries?
Bhutan tops the list, receiving about 63% of that budget, roughly $981 million.
Wow, that's a lot.
It's largely driven by India's interest in developing Bhutan's hydropower sector.
Ah, so it's a win-win. Bhutan gets infrastructure development, and India gets a reliable source of clean energy.
Exactly. Smart move.
Very strategic. What about other recipients?
Afghanistan comes in second, receiving about 7% or $108 million.
Okay.
India's been instrumental in supporting large-scale projects there, like the new parliament building in Kabul and the Salma Dam in Herat.
Wow, so they're really investing in the region.
They are. And beyond Bhutan and Afghanistan, they're also providing aid to Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and even the Maldives.
So it's clear that India is using aid to foster goodwill and exert its influence in the region.
You got it.
But it wasn't always like this, was it? Their approach to foreign aid has evolved over time, right?
Absolutely, especially when it comes to natural disasters.
Right.
A turning point came after the devastating 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami.
I remember that. The images were just heartbreaking.
It was a tragedy.
Didn't India refuse foreign aid after the tsunami?
They did. It was a bold move, a deliberate decision to show they could handle the crisis independently.
To shed that poor country image.
Exactly. And it was a departure from their previous response to calamities like the Bihar floods and the Gujarat earthquake.
Which they had accepted aid for.
Right.
So the 2004 tsunami marked a shift towards this aid provider role they're embracing now.
Exactly.
It solidified their commitment to self-reliance and regional leadership.
And they've backed it up with action. They've helped their neighbors during crises and even provided aid to the U.S. and China.
To the U.S. and China.
Yeah. For example, after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, they sent tons of relief material on Air Force aircraft to the U.S., and they did the same for China after the 2008 Sichuan earthquake.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful statement. So India's relationship with foreign aid is clearly evolving. But what about the aid that's still coming into India? How is that managed?
Well, that's where the FCRA comes in.
The FCRA.
Yeah, the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act.
Okay.
It regulates the foreign funds received by NGOs in India.
NGOs, okay. And when was this act passed?
It was enacted in 2010. It's all about transparency and accountability.
Right, that makes sense. So break it down for us. What are the key elements of this FCRA and why is it so important?
Sure. Basically, it lays out the rules for NGOs in India that receive any kind of foreign funding. Donations, gifts, grants, you name it.
Okay.
And any organization wanting to access these funds has to register under the FCRA.
So it's not automatic.
Nope. The government can deny, suspend, or even cancel registration if they have concerns.
What kind of concerns would lead to that?
Well, one major red flag is if an organization is deemed to be acting against the national interest.
National interests, that's pretty broad.
It is, and that's where things can get complicated.
Right, because who decides what's in the national interest?
That would be the Ministry of Home Affairs.
Okay.
They're responsible for implementing the FCRA, and they have a fair amount of leeway in interpreting its provisions.
So there's a lot of power vested in the ministry. What else does the FCRA cover?
It gets into the specifics of how the funds can be used. For example, administrative expenses can exceed 50% of the foreign contributions received in a year.
So that most of the money goes to the actual cause.
Exactly. Transparency is key. Registered NGOs have to submit detailed annual reports to the ministry.
Covering.
Income, expenses, receipts, even their balance sheet.
Wow, so they really have to keep track of everything.
They do. And even if they don't receive any foreign funds in a given year, they still have to file an NIL report.
Just to confirm that there's no foreign funding activity.
Precisely. It's all about accountability.
And we've mentioned that nearly 19,000 NGOs have lost their FCRA registration since 2011. What's behind that?
Well, that's a complex question. The government says many of these NGOs weren't complying with FCRA regulations.
Maybe not filing reports or using funds improperly.
Right, but there are also accusations that this crackdown is politically motivated.
Targeting organizations critical of government policies.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of debate about whether this is about enforcing regulations or silencing dissenting voices.
It's a tricky situation with potentially far-reaching consequences.
It certainly is. And it raises some really important questions about transparency, accountability, and the very nature of foreign aid. We need to explore this further.
This whole issue of regulating foreign funding, it's a tricky one.
Yeah.
Governments want transparency. They want to prevent misuse.
Right.
But they also risk stifling the work that NGOs do. It's a real balancing act.
Absolutely. And as we delve deeper into this FCRA, we'll see how that balancing act plays out. And it's interesting, this is the first time India has grappled with this. This current FCRA, the one from 2010, actually replaced an older version from 1976.
Right, right.
So it's an ongoing conversation, a continuous process of refining these regulations.
Exactly.
So the 2010 FCRA, this is the current framework governing how NGOs in India can receive and use funds from outside the country. Who exactly does this act apply to?
Well, it's a pretty wide range. Individuals, corporations, various Indian entities, NRIs, overseas branches of Indian companies.
So anyone who might be receiving foreign funds.
Pretty much. It's not just about the money itself, but also how it's used. And that's where it gets complicated.
Okay, so we've got a diverse range of actors potentially receiving these funds, and the FCRAs, the rule book they need to follow. What are some of the key provisions that NGOs need to be aware of?
Well, the first thing is any organization wanting to receive foreign contributions needs to register under the FCRA.
Okay.
And it's not a guarantee. The government has the power to scrutinize applications. They can deny them, suspend them, or even cancel registration if they have concerns.
So it's not just a matter of filling out a form and getting approved. There's a vetting process involved.
Right.
What kind of concerns would lead to an NGO being denied registration or having their registration revoked?
One of the big ones is if the organization is perceived to be acting against the national interest.
National interest. Again, that's a pretty broad term.
It is, and its interpretation can be subjective. This is where the government has significant power.
Right, so who gets to decide what aligns with the national interest?
Ultimately, it's the Ministry of Home Affairs.
Okay.
They're the ones who implement the FCRA. They assess an NGO's activities.
And they decide whether those activities are in line with the national interest.
Exactly.
So a lot hinges on their interpretation of that phrase. What are some other key aspects of the FCRA that NGOs need to navigate?
It goes into detail about how these foreign funds can be used. For instance, there's a restriction on administrative expenses.
Okay.
NGOs can't use more than 50% of their foreign contributions for administrative purposes in a year.
So the majority of the funds have to go towards the actual charitable work, the projects that benefit people.
Exactly, the intended beneficiaries.
Right. So donors want to know that their contributions are making a difference, not just going towards overhead costs.
Exactly. Accountability is crucial. The FCRA also has strict reporting requirements. Registered NGOs have to submit these really detailed annual reports to the Ministry of Home Affairs.
Detailed in what way?
We're talking income and expenditure statements, receipts, their balance sheet.
Wow, they really have to keep track of everything.
They do. And even if an NGO doesn't receive any foreign funding in a particular year, they still have to file an NIL report.
Just to confirm that there's no activity.
Exactly. Transparency is key.
Okay, so there's a big emphasis on transparency. NGOs need to be able to demonstrate how they're using these funds.
Right.
And even with these regulations, there have been cases where NGOs have fallen short.
Unfortunately, yes. Whether it's unintentional errors or deliberate misuse, it happens. And that fuels the debate around the need for oversight.
Right, it makes the whole thing more complex. And that brings us back to that figure we mentioned earlier. Nearly 19,000 NGOs have lost their FCRA registrations since 2011. What's really going on there? Is it solely about enforcing regulations, or are there other factors at play?
Well, it's a multi-layered issue. We talked about concerns that this crackdown might be politically motivated.
Right, targeting organizations that are critical of the government.
Yeah, so how do we disentangle these narratives?
Right, that's a tough one.
Is it really just about enforcing the rules, or are there deeper political currents?
It's a complex puzzle.
Some argue that the government is genuinely committed to ensuring these funds are used properly.
And that any misuse should have consequences.
Exactly. They point to instances where NGOs have clearly violated the FCRA, so they say strict enforcement is necessary.
But others see it differently, right?
Right, there's that counter-narrative that this is about silencing dissenting voices, shrinking the space for civil society.
Especially for organizations working on sensitive issues that might not align with the government's priorities.
Exactly. So we're back to that balancing act.
Transparency and accountability on one hand.
And the potential for these regulations to restrict dissent and limit critical voices on the other.
You hit the nail on the head. And this tension isn't unique to India. Governments around the world are dealing with this.
They are.
How do you balance national interests with the role of a vibrant and independent civil society?
It's the big question.
It is. And it's a conversation with far-reaching implications. But let's zoom back in on India for a moment. What's the practical impact of all of this? How are NGOs on the ground adapting to this changing landscape?
Well, for many NGOs, particularly smaller ones that rely heavily on foreign funding, Losing their FCRA registration can be devastating.
Right.
It can force them to scale back, lay off staff, sometimes even shut down completely.
And that obviously has a ripple effect on the communities they serve.
It does.
So it's not just an abstract policy debate. This is having real consequences. What options do these NGOs have when they face the loss of this funding?
Some try to diversify their funding, looking for more domestic contributions or partnerships with local businesses.
Right.
Others try to align their work more closely with government priorities, hoping to get funding through official channels.
But those strategies aren't always successful, are they?
No, not always. For many NGOs, especially those working on issues that challenge the status quo, it can be difficult to attract that domestic funding or to align their work without compromising their values and their mission.
Right, so they're in a tough spot.
They are. It really underscores the importance of protecting the space for an independent civil society.
One that can hold power accountable and advocate for the needs of marginalized communities.
Exactly.
So as we go into specific examples of how this is playing out in India,
Yeah.
it's crucial to keep this broader context in mind. It's not just about regulations. It's about the very fabric of Indian democracy.
You got it.
We've been talking about this FCRA, this law regulating foreign funding for NGOs in India. It's a complex issue for sure.
Definite. A lot of layers to it.
We've seen it's not just about the regulations themselves. It's about power, accountability, the role of civil society in a democracy.
Absolutely.
To really get a grasp on the impact of this FCRA, I think it helps to look at some specific examples, some real-world cases.
Absolutely. Real-world cases can really highlight the nuances and the potential consequences.
We touched on Amnesty International earlier and that CBI raid on their offices. That really sent shockwaves through the NGO community.
But yeah, for sure. It was a strong signal that the government is willing to investigate and potentially penalize organizations that they see as stepping over the line.
And Amnesty International isn't the only high-profile organization that's been targeted.
No, not at all. Greenpeace is another good example. They were vocal critics of a lot of development projects, raising concerns about environmental impact.
And that brought them into conflict with some powerful interests.
It did, and they ended up facing consequences.
What happened with Greenpeace in India?
Well, in 2015, their FCRA registration was canceled. The government accused them of harming the national interest. Specifically, they said Greenpeace was obstructing development projects and working with foreign groups to hurt the Indian economy.
Those are pretty serious allegations.
They are. Greenpeace denied them, of course. They said they were being targeted because of their environmental advocacy work. They even challenged the cancellation in court.
Yeah.
They weren't successful.
So they were essentially cut off from a major source of funding.
Basically, yes. No more foreign funds. Their operations in India were significantly impacted.
It's a stark example of how this FCRA can be used to silence dissent.
Yeah.
Even when it comes from groups working on globally important issues like the environment.
Yeah, it's a powerful example.
What about the Ford Foundation? We mentioned them earlier.
The Ford Foundation, that's an interesting case. They're one of the biggest philanthropic organizations in the world.
Yeah.
They've been supporting development projects in India for a long time, decades even.
But they ended up on a government watch list in 2015, right?
They did.
What happened there?
The government raised concerns about some of the grants the Ford Foundation had given to NGOs in India.
What was the issue?
They claimed these funds were being used to fuel protests and disrupt public order.
So again, this sensitivity to foreign funding being used for anything that might be seen as anti-government.
Exactly. Even if it's framed as promoting social justice or human rights, it suggests a real wariness about any external influence on domestic issues.
And this isn't just limited to environmental or human rights groups.
No, even organizations working on religious issues have been scrutinized. Compassion International, for example. It's a U.S.-based Christian charity that helps children living in poverty.
Okay.
They had been working in India for a long time, but in 2017, their work was basically shut down.
What happened?
The government put them on a prior permission list.
Meaning?
Any foreign funds they received had to be pre-approved by the government.
So it became nearly impossible for them to operate effectively.
Pretty much.
It seems like the FCRA is being used to control not just money, but ideas as well.
That's one way to look at it. Shaping the narrative, potentially silencing dissenting voices.
Many critics of the FCRA would agree with that.
Yes, they would.
So where does this leave us? What's the future for foreign funding in India, especially for these NGOs working on sensitive issues?
It's a big question. The government hasn't shown any signs of easing up on the FCRA. If anything, the regulations seem to be getting tighter.
What does that mean for the NGOs working to make a difference?
It's a challenging environment, a lot of regulations to navigate, a shrinking pool of donors, the constant risk of running afoul of the government.
It sounds like a really tough situation.
It is. But even with these challenges, there are so many NGOs in India doing incredible work, providing services, advocating for rights, protecting the environment. Their dedication is inspiring.
That's good to hear. So after this deep dive into the FCRA and foreign aid, what are the key takeaways for our listeners?
I think the main thing is this is a complex issue. There are no easy answers. Foreign aid can be a force for good, but we have to be aware of the potential for misuse, the power dynamics at play, the impact of regulations like the FCRA.
We've looked at the history of foreign aid in India, the shift from recipient to donor, the way this FCRA shapes the landscape for NGOs. It's a conversation that goes beyond regulations. It's about democracy, freedom of expression, the right to dissent.
And going forward, it's important to have this conversation in a thoughtful and critical way.
We've covered a lot of ground today. We hope this deep dive has been informative. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that bell icon so you don't miss out on future deep dives. We've got lots more to explore.
Until next time, keep diving.